conference which began today and continues tomorrow. We know that many are also watching online from Greece and Cyprus. We're very pleased that so many friends can join us. And I also know that the chairman of the Anglo-Hellenic League, our co-host for this evening, John Kitmer, is watching from my beloved Yorkshire, and he is most welcome, particularly because he's watching from Yorkshire. So, as I have mentioned, tonight's event is organized by the Hellenic Observatory here at the London School of Economics, but in collaboration with the Anglo-Hellenic League as well. We're here in the Shaw Library at the LSE, and I was just thinking this morning that in this library, 50 years ago, I'm sure that Mrs. Richard Clogg probably was discussing with her young historian husband many times the events of 1974 in this very room. Mary Jo Clogg was a librarian here in the then Shaw Library. And I'm sure they must have talked a lot about the dramatic events of 74, the fall of the junta in July, the events in Cyprus, the Greek colonel's failed coup attempt against Archbishop Makarios, the 2 invasions by Turkey, the dislocation of many thousands, and the division of the island with the United Nations Green Line. The progress of events in Greece and in Cyprus, when viewed from London in particular, must have seemed very rapid. Last year, we had a very interesting panel discussion about the Athens Polytechnic uprising in November 1973. And we looked at the antecedents to the fall of the colonel's junta. Tonight, we're moving on in the chronology. Of course, the fall of the colonel's regime in Greece was met with much celebration in Athens. But for Cyprus, of course, the events of 1974 were a tragedy, with the traumatic events still lingering today. Britain, as a guarantor power under the 1960 Constitution for Cyprus, had a distinct responsibility, but London also had to work out its relations with Washington and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, defining the Western interest in response to what was happening in Greece and Cyprus. In some diplomatic circles in the UK, on occasions it seemed that talking about Cyprus and the events of 1974 have almost been some kind of taboo, dangerous for British diplomats, British politicians to talk about those events which sensitive, events which elicits much criticism. But a university setting is precisely the setting where we should be reviewing our history and reviewing the implications of the 1974 events. We're here to discuss some critical questions. How the Greek junta had been seen in the UK, what was the reaction of the Labour government of Harold Wilson to the seemingly fast-changing events in Athens and Cyprus? What were the consequences of Britain's actions or inactions to these events? Basically, what changed, if anything, in the basic strategy of Britain on Cyprus? How was the solution to what became known as the Cyprus problem affected? Surely, 50 years later, we can discuss these matters in an objective fashion, dispassionately, respectfully of different views. I'm sure when it comes to the Q&A later, that will be the spirit in which we engage in the discussion of those events. To set matters in context, we have an experts panel. In a moment, we're going to show a pre-recorded interview with Sir Roger Tomkys. Sir Roger was a senior British diplomat in the Athens embassy from 1972 to 1974. I must say, looking back, I'm rather envious of being there, being able to observe these particular events. But Sir Roger was also, many years later, chairman of the Anglo-Hellenic League, as I say, our co-host for this evening. So in this pre-recorded interview, I ask him questions about his recollections from 1974. After the video, we'll then have two presentations. I should say that we're very sorry to announce that one of our listed speakers, Irene Karamuzi, is no longer able to join us. She has to remain in Athens as she's not well. She sends her sincere apologies, and we wish her the very best at this difficult time. We're very pleased, though, to welcome two important scholars to share their thoughts with us. Dr. Konstantina Maragkou is Associate Lecturer at Newcastle University. She's a specialist in contemporary history, and she's the author of the book Britain, Greece, and the Colonels, 1967 to 1974, A Troubled Relationship. It couldn't be more relevant to our discussion this evening. She will speak about how the Greek junta was seen in London and how that affected subsequent events. More importantly, Konstantina is a former research fellow in the Hellenic Observatory here at the LSE. It's a pleasure to welcome her back. Neophytos Loizides is Professor of International Conflict Analysis at the University of Warwick. Before joining Warwick, he taught at the University of Kent, where he directed the Conflict Analysis Research Centre. Professor Loizides has written extensively on matters such as forced displacement, nationalism, and conflict regulation in deeply divided societies. Tonight, he'll be talking about the impact of 1974 on the division of Cyprus, but more particularly, setting UK Cypriot relations in a longer-term perspective, both before 74 and subsequently. And we will then have a Q&A with you, the audience, and we'll be inviting those colleagues who are joining us online to send us their questions as well. I'll mention the format later. After this intellectual entertainment, this is a very important discussion, you're all invited to an LSE wine reception. Let me mention, so that we manage expectations, it is an LSE wine reception, and I'm sure you'll appreciate the ambiance of the environment rather than necessarily the wine you're being served. But that will take place immediately below here on floor 5 of this building. And we can then discuss matters more informally then. So let's begin. We're going to show the pre-recorded interview with Sir Roger Tomkys, and then we'll start our presentations and discussion here. Can I pass over? Sir Roger, thank you for accepting this interview. As you know, we're recording this interview for an event which is being held at the LSE and is co-hosted with the Anglo-Hellenic League. I must begin by recognizing that you are indeed a past chairman of the Anglo-Hellenic League, and I believe you were chair between 1993 and 1999. Could I just ask you to tell us briefly how you saw the role of the Anglo-Hellenic League in that period? What kind of purpose or mission did you have for the League?
Well, let's, if I can ask you to allow a little for the time that has passed. It's a long time ago. I became chairman of the League pretty well by accident, I think. For various reasons. Most of my predecessors had been British ambassadors in Athens, and at that time, Brooks Richards, who was my predecessor and had been my ambassador in Athens when I was relatively junior there, he had personal reasons to want to give up the chairmanship, and there wasn't an immediate past ambassador available. So I was dragooned into it almost physically by Brooks Richards and by George Jellicoe, which was a bit symbolic of the way I saw the League, at any rate, when I was associated with it, in that it still smacked a great deal of combination of old Philhellenism here and of wartime experience. Not only Brooks Richards and George Jellicoe, but the administrator, Nan White Gaze, would tell me what was what, and we would have a drink at the Special Forces Club around the corner from Harrods. And there was quite a sense of the immediately post-war period. Lunch organized by the ladies of the Greek community in London were pretty heavily into ship owning. At Sears's, Stephen Runciman would turn up, and it felt as though it was the friendships of that period that was the rock on which the League stood. There was a book prize, was an annual event. I'm ashamed to say I've forgotten the sequence of the book prizes, but at one stage it was the Onassis Prize, and at another it had been had another name for it, which has now slipped my mind. But the book prize and lunch at Sears's and the old Philhellenes and the ladies who looked after me very well, that's the context that I saw it in.
Well, thank you. It's fascinating to hear about the Anglo-Hellenic League in a period where there was so much wartime experience as a foundation for Philhellenism in the UK. Let's move on to the focus of our discussion at the LSE. As I've mentioned, the focus is very much on the Greek colonel's regime. And in parts of that period, you were head of chancery in Athens. I wonder if we could just begin by talking about the international perceptions of the Greek colonel's regime. Of course, in the UK, specifically in London, there was quite strong criticism about the regime's nature. But for British foreign policy, that had to be tempered with the sense that Greece remained an important NATO ally. So I wonder what your memory is of the significance of the public criticism for British policy towards Greece during the time of the junta.
Yes, it's not easy to strike the balance. It probably wasn't easy to strike the balance then. There was a revulsion in Britain at the colonel's takeover in the 60s. And I'm not entirely sure how the balance of that was made up, partly of Philhellenism and a fairly romantic attachment to the idea of Greece as the home of democracy, and how much there was a certain attachment also to the royal connections between Greece and Great Britain, particularly, of course, with Prince Philip being a member of the Greek royal family. and how much was distaste for the colonels as such. It had bedded down by the time I got to Greece in 1972. There were hardly any ministerial contacts. I think only one in my time. Minister of State may have come out in my time once, Minister of State for Trade, if I remember rightly. But high-level contact was in the freezer. The colonels would have liked to have had much closer contact with us and made it quite clear that they were open to much closer association and that they would keep it private if necessary. But on the whole, we kept our distance while hoping to do enough. It was Lord Limerick who came out, I now remember, and I think he was the only minister for years. We kept our distance despite the trying to encourage a warming up of this. But at the same time, we maintained the military links. We had a very good half-Greek military advisor there, who was absolutely splendid man, and he had very close contacts with the Greek armed forces. So it was awkward, but quite clearly limited by our disapproval of the end of the suspension of democracy. It's possible to have differing views about how awful the colonels were. I sometimes felt that it was just a bit snobbish to regard them as so awful. They didn't come from Kolonaki and they didn't have very good manners. And they sent people off to horrible villages in the Pindus where there were bears in the winter and everything was insupportable. But the efforts to keep them in play as far as NATO was concerned, while not doing anything which would show approval of the colonels, was I think, a settled program by the time that I got there in 1972. And by late 73, Ioannidis coming in to replace Papadopoulos, the skids were under them, and they were going downhill, and it was just a question of when and how there would be some sort of restoration of a different form of life.
Thank you. And I understand that at the time in November 1973 of the protests at the Polytechnic in Athens, the Polytechnio, you actually went along with your friend from the Greek Foreign Ministry, Konstantina Stepos, and you walked around the area of the Polytechnic. That must have been very risky for foreign diplomats to do. What do you remember thinking about the events? And was there a sense of these events as significant? Something's going to happen after these events.
I can't remember very clearly what motivated me, except that Kostas Epos and his wife were part of a group of friends whom I saw a great deal. It's a lot to be said for being a junior diplomat in an embassy which is an embassy to a regime of whom you do not approve, because everybody in opposition to the regime is anxious to have contacts in foreign legations, and it isn't proper for the ambassador to be seen to be trailing his coat from me. So I had a lot of very good contacts, many of them, no, not all of them, left of centre. And Costas and his wife were very, very much friends. They had two girls who were at the Polytechnic, and they were worried sick about them during the riots and went out looking for them. And quite why I was there, I mean, I wasn't there to exercise any diplomatic presence. I was just helping a friend look for his children.
Was there a sense that the events were momentous, or something might just pass?
I think it was symbolic of the disintegration of the colonel's regime and control. There were quite a lot of things happened in that autumn, which you will know better than I do, because I've forgotten, but of tanks rolling through. We were in Seago, where we had a house in Seago at the time, and sometimes it was safe for my children to go down into Athens, and sometimes it wasn't, and weren't adjusting to a life which was becoming more and more disturbed.
As you say, the colonel's regime was already very wobbly at the end of 1973. And then in 1974, there was the surprise of the Greek colonel's intervention, military intervention in Cyprus. How big a surprise was the colonel's action in Cyprus to London, do you think?
I think a complete surprise, but I was in a peculiar position because I was on leave at the time. I was in London. And staying with a friend, Alan Goodison, who was the head of the Southern European Department. And as soon as the coup in Cyprus took place, we had to go, both of us, straight into the office and try and sort out what had happened and what our response to it would be. So I saw that part of it from the London end, and I knew pretty well what was happening there. But I'm not a witness to what was happening in the embassy at the time.
So there's a sense of disorientation, I guess. A little later, in the summer of '74, I understand you joined Foreign Secretary James Callaghan to go to the Geneva conference on Cyprus. And you were met at the airport in Geneva by Kostas Zepos, your friend from the Greek Foreign Ministry. And I understand he was pressing on you to relay to the Foreign Secretary and others that the aim of the Geneva conference should be limited. That is, the aim should be to establish an immediate ceasefire in Cyprus, and the conference should not set bigger ambitions for itself, because there was the fear in Athens that to do so might require the new democratic government of Greece to make some very difficult concessions. And Kostas Zepos said that both he, but also Yorgos Mavros, the foreign minister of the new government, thought that any concessions to be made by the Greek government at that time could have undermined the transition to democracy. And then I understand you obviously conveyed that message back to your colleagues and the foreign minister, Callaghan. But I understand you subsequently harbored some misgivings about what you did in relation to the Zepos message and how you conveyed it back. Why did you feel uneasy about passing the message on?
Well, I think I've got to go back a little bit, because for me it's a sort of a continuum between what we were doing in London and what happened when we arrived at Geneva. What we were doing in London was looking how to respond to the events which had happened, which, as we saw them at the time, I think, again, memories, was the colonels were clearly associated with it, but it was manifest as being something which had happened in Cyprus by Greek Cypriots, the Enosys effect. And the first question that we faced was, what are the Turks going to do, and what do we do? And we had a pretty lively time there with a sample of American policy, which stuck very much in my mind. Joe Sisko, who was the Assistant Secretary of State coming back from Turkey and purporting to call purporting to call Kissinger over the phone, Washington, with us all in Jim Callahan's room at the time, to tell Kissinger that he had talked very hard to the Turks, and the one thing he could say was that they were not going to get involved. And we all thought that this was not addressed to Kissinger, it was addressed to us in the room. And really so it proved. But the Americans wanted to warn us off. What they knew, I don't know, but they were warning us off. And we, Jim Callahan, we were guarantors at the London settlement. And our question was, what can we do in these circumstances to try to get some sort of settlement in Cyprus, which might prove peaceful and durable? What could we aim for? With the background of this misinformation coming in directly from Cisco and the American moves. Well, you're quite right. I'd done a little paper, and we concluded that we ought to try to go not for a settlement of all the differences between Greece and Turkey, but not for just a ceasefire, but we should go to try to get the basis for some sort of political settlement in Cyprus while the iron was hot, is really the term. And it'd been agreed that that's what we ought to have gone for. And yes, when I arrived at Nicosia Airport, Konstantinos was there waiting to get hold of us, because he knew me. He got hold of me, and as you say, he said it will be the end of restoration of democracy in Greece if you press us to talk about any form of confederal or federal set up in Cyprus. And I conveyed that. And yes, I have a slight, no, not a slight, I have had a very long-lasting uncertainty whether, in conveying this to Jim Callahan, I should or should not have said how true this is, how serious it is. Zepos was chef de cabinet to George Mavros at the time. How firm this is, this threat, I don't know, but they are warning us off. And if we do not go to define the range of the discussions, we may lose the only chance that we have of getting this right. And I simply don't know. In a way, it's just my questioning myself about what the range that an individual diplomat should judge to be within his duties to steer or at least question the information which factually I had conveyed to his masters.
Yes, I guess it's at the height of a crisis like this, it's one of those inevitable what if questions which lingers. But thank you very much indeed for sharing your recollections. And we'll now pass over to the event at the LSE. But thank you, Sir Roger, very much indeed.
Well, I hope it's been.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you to Sir Roger for the pre-recorded interview present at those events. Very pleased. And as I mentioned in the introduction, we're going to begin with Konstantina, and she's going to be looking at Britain's relations with the Greek colonels.
How do I set this on?
It's already on.
Okay, wonderful, great. Good evening. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Kevin, and indeed for the invitation to take part in this event. Thank you all for coming. Hopefully you'll also be able to contribute with your questions later on today. It's wonderful to be back. My first academic appointment was here at the LSE, and it was during this time that I was able to enlarge the scope, the chronological scope of my PhD that had focused on Wilson's government's first labor government policies towards the Greek colonels between 67 and 70. And my time here at the LSE enabled me to go back to the archives and do a full-out research for British policy towards the colonels up until 1974 to come up with some comparisons and conclusions about the evolution of British stance towards the colonels under different governments for the whole time that the colonels stayed in power. I'm also very pleased to hear the input, the invaluable input of Sir Roger tonight. I did have the chance to interview him as part of my PhD, and it is one of the reasons why I do personally find contemporary history particularly fascinating. It gives me the chance as a historian when navigating and exploring and revisiting historical events to garner the invaluable insights of people who witnessed the events, people who took part in the events, people who shaped events. And of course, I do realize that there are special filters we need to apply to these narratives. But nonetheless, I do find them fascinating. And I will indeed agree also with most of the evaluations that Sir Roger shared with us tonight. The relationships that permeated Anglo-Greek dealings in the period of the colonel's regime were certainly very awkward indeed. He mentioned the phrase very difficult. I think that's how he started his discussion and his presentation tonight, as being very difficult to strike the right balance. What is very clear from those years is that both governments, both Wilson's government being 67 and 70, and then the Conservatives under Heath 70 to 74, up until Wilson returns to power in February of 74, they had very clear objectives vis-a-vis Greece. Every foreign office memorandum that I've come across in my research clearly spells out 4 to start with, and eventually 3 objectives. The very first one is that they would not like to do anything to jeopardize NATO unity. This is the very first priority, the very first concern that seems to be guiding British foreign policy at the time. Of course, the argument can be made, but why was it so important? This is the late 1960s into the 1970s. We do have detente taking place, perhaps with a lessening of Cold War tensions, but Greece's neuralgic position in the Mediterranean and the fact that since the 1960s, the Mediterranean theater has started to assume increased significance in Cold War affairs, first of all, with the increasing naval Soviet presence in Mediterranean waters, which was translated as perhaps an ambition on behalf of the Soviet Union to have a play and a role in developments in countries that are around the Mediterranean basin was really important. And of course, since the 1960s, we are starting to witness increasing tensions in the Middle East. Only a few weeks after the colonels come to power, we have the 6-day war. So this kind of developments heightened the absolutely crucial role and crucial factor of having access to Greece's military as well as Turkey's military and strategic sort of bases at the time. So that is the number one factor that, as I said, permeates and consistently appears as the leading factor in British attitudes towards the colonies, official British attitudes towards the colonies, if I may say so. The second one, of course, is Cyprus. This government, both Wilson's and Heath's government, are very conscious of the special role and the responsibility that this government is carrying as a guarantor, one of the guarantor powers, following the treaties in 1960. And they insist that they need to keep in close relations with the colonels because they need to be able to influence and have an open channel of communication to make sure that stability and democracy and safeguarding of their interests in Cyprus remain unaffected and safeguarded, really. The third one that seems to be preoccupying the government, both governments at the time, is the fact that they see an opportunity with the colonels to perhaps increase their commercial and financial dealings. Britain at the time British economy was ailing at the time. It is a deterioration that had already started with the Second World War and certainly escalated after a number of debacles like the Suez Crisis, but certainly we have the devaluation of the sterling just around the time when the colonels are in power. The colonels are fully aware of that, and they do make a number of openings towards this government about some commercial, very lucrative commercial dealings, as well as military sales as well that would perhaps prove very beneficial indeed for the Treasury. And indeed, the Treasury on a number of occasions interferes with the British Foreign Office during the 7 years to remind their colleagues in the Foreign Office of the absolute importance of not openly confronting the colonels and alienating them. So these three key tenets are really sustaining British attitude, British thinking about the importance of not alienating, not enraging the colonels and jeopardizing their relatively close relations with them. The fourth one, which is very interesting and is very prominent at the beginning of the colonel's regime, is the need to ensure that democracy is restored in Greece. This starts disappearing from eventual Foreign Office memoranda, certainly into the 1970s, not because this government stopped being interested, ceased to have an interest in the restoration of Greek democracy, but because they realized that their power in that country and their power to achieve so is indeed rather limited. So on the one hand, we have very, very clear priorities that are guiding British foreign policy throughout. And on the other hand, we have a country and a public that clearly stands out in its pretty phenomenal opposition to the colonel's regime. The way that the British public mobilized spontaneously at the very beginning, but started becoming more organized and more vociferous in its opposition to the colonels. Initially because of the way that they took control, their unconstitutional measures that they instituted and the derogation, the rape of Greek democracy, as it came to be known. And eventually, soon after, when allegations about the rather barbaric and torturous methods that the regime was systematically using in order to thwart internal opposition, started to hit a very sensitive nerve in this country. There are a number of reasons why the British public was particularly sensitive to these allegations. Sir Roger alluded to some of them, the romantic idea of Greece as the cradle of democracy, a number of obviously people from this country having fought for Greek independence during the Second World War. The fact, of course, that there is a clear connection between the royal and the British, the Greek and the British royal family, and a number of various reasons, all the kind of affinities that people in the British public started having as a result of the advent of mass tourism and, visiting Greece in the late 1950s and early 1960s and forming wonderful memories from their time there and getting to know locals. So they were extremely interested and sensitive to those allegations. They started, as I said, with some spontaneous...
So could you speak a bit closer to the microphone?
Yes, sure, thank you. They started with some spontaneous mobilizations. There were protests. They occupied the British Embassy in London. The mobilization started becoming much organized, especially around important anniversaries during the time that the Gunners stayed in power. I've been struck by the thousands of letters that constituents from throughout the country sent to their MPs in order to persuade them to put pressure on the British government to curtail its dealings with the Greek colonels. I've seen hundreds of petitions that were signed for this government to stop dealing and having any official relationship with the Greek colonels altogether. And even from associations that professional associations, one would not necessarily expect to see, not just from trade unions, but from the Association of Plumbers and electricians and teachers and civil aviation engineers. It really gave me the impression that every part of this country was really showing a very clear interest in the affairs in Greece. And this is very easily corroborated by the fact that if anyone is looking into the digital archives of both The Guardian and The Times at the time, we'll see that the search will yield thousands of entries in the 7 years about Greece, the 7 years that the colonels stayed in power. So on the one hand, we have a government that is certainly, I will totally agree, from my findings, it's clear that they are not happy and content with the colonels. Indeed, there is quite a lot of clear antipathy about their abilities. There are all sort of different adjectives that they use in their correspondence to characterize them, all the way from unpleasant to ineffective to thuggish. This is so on and so forth. The list can go on. But they do realize that they need to continue doing business with them. They try to keep aloof, but this is not enough for the British public, which fights back on a number of occasions. And British find themselves even among official circles admitting that their policy perhaps is not heroic or moral enough. It is very ambiguous to say, it remains very ambiguous at the very least. There is no clear rancor in this business as usual approach that both the government under Wilson and the government under Heath is implementing. Perhaps the former one is a little bit more reactive. The latter one is a bit more proactive. One explanation for that is that by the 1970s, it was clear that the colonels would stay here for the foreseeable future. So this government was agonizing to find some more ways to perhaps build better bridges with the colonels, perhaps take a better share of the military sales to Greece. They were realizing by the early 1970s that they were seriously losing out to West Germany, for instance, and France. Both countries were much less polemical against the colonels in their official dealings. But it's clear that overall, under the 7 years that the regime stayed in power, both governments under no circumstances considered curtailing or breaking their relations with the colonels for the reasons that for the national interests that they already touched upon. They kept pressing that the reason why they are carrying on having this kind of business as usual, even if in an aloof way, is because they want to be close to the colonels and to be able to influence events and hopefully to help stir them towards the return to democracy and democratic rule. There was a lot of outcry on behalf of the British public, who very often accused their own governments as hypocritical. It's also interesting to note that there was a lot of outcry on behalf of backbenchers, and you may think, well, it's because of their role and their position in parliament that they're a bit more able to voice this dissatisfaction. But it's also interesting to know that there were divisions within the cabinets. Often we have, for instance, Barbara Castle, we have Tony Benn on a number of occasions, we have Prime Minister Wilson on occasions calling the colonels barbarous. They did soon realize that this kind of open expressions of their antipathy were countereffectual, and they stopped and they started to try to rebuild their bridges. But ultimately, I don't think that British policy at the time was particularly beneficial. For one thing, they certainly did not help restore democracy in Greece. They certainly did not increase their commercial dealings with the Greek colonels. And they certainly did not help restore democracy in Greece. They certainly did not increase their commercial dealings with the Greek colonels. They certainly did not increase their commercial dealings with the Greek colonels. They certainly did not increase their commercial dealings with the Greek colonels. They certainly did not increase their commercial dealings with the Greek colonels. Well, unity within NATO was preserved, despite the fact that the colonels on a number of occasions threatened to leave the NATO if Britain kept antagonizing the regime, and they threatened to follow the Nasser way, as they used to say, in order to apply pressure. It did not satisfy or tame the British public, and certainly did not help projecting a positive picture abroad. Indeed, the British government on a number of occasions was reluctant to take a negative approach towards Greece within UN, within the Council of Europe. Indeed, up until when discussions were taking place for the expulsion of Greece from the Council of Europe between 1967 and 1969 on the account of its human rights abuses, the British were consistently not in the Council of Ministers, consistently not siding with those groups of the countries like the Scandinavians, who were very clear about the need to expel the country on those because of the human rights transgressions. So a pragmatic policy overall, sort of combined with some allusions for sort of ethical considerations, which did not amount to much, if I'm honest, in terms of their actual effect. Not particularly beneficial, but very, very clear and very representative of the clash that the government often faces when it comes to power, and administration when it comes to power, between its own ideology and competing national interests. So I would like to conclude with that for the moment, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If I may, Konstantina, I wonder if I could just invite you to say a couple of things more. I understand that when you've been looking at the archives, British government papers for this period, there's a sense in those official papers that the British governments felt that something was going to happen with the junta, but also something was going to happen with Turkey and Cyprus. Do you want to just add a couple of sentences on that?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier on, Kevin, I have not looked too extensively into the period 74 and onwards, but certainly from 1973 onwards, there is a clear understanding. There is some kind of official relief when the Marquezines experiment takes place. They seem to be quite supportive, and they are actually preparing communiques, open communiques, public communiques, to say that they are behind this new administration, this new government, this new prime minister, and they are going to be supporting and looking forward to fostering closer relationships with them. Of course, then we have the events of the Polytechnic. We have obviously the Ioannidis coming to government, and it's clear that their appreciation of the British appreciation of Greek events at the time are really, really negative, to the point that when Wilson comes to power, he doesn't even care about public perceptions anymore. He cancels the naval visits. You heard Sir Roger talking about this. Their perception is that this is actually not going to last. So they do almost look like they want to be on the right side of history. They are much more outspoken with their criticisms. And this idea, which the conservatives had already started creating from 1972, late 1972 into 1973, about cultivating some closer relationships and perhaps having some ministerial exchanges and visits, is something that they put total brake on, because they do anticipate events to escalate. I have actually found also references that they do report on the tensions in Cyprus as starting to boil, and they do seem to expect something to perhaps happen in the latter part of the summer into autumn. I have not, as I said, I have not studied that period exclusively yet, but I cannot present to you very solid evidence right now as to what this might have been. I'm not sure if this is something they identify clearly in the papers, but there is an ease. They do know, as I said before, into the early 1970s that the colonels are going to be here for the foreseeable future. This starts to be changing post Ioannidis, post-Marquezines time, when the Ioannidis comes to power. They seem to be clear that this is not going to last. They are very concerned about the effect that this may have for NATO unity, and especially for Cyprus, and they do think that the intercommunal tensions in Cyprus are looking rather problematic and troublesome.
Okay, thanks. I can't miss the opportunity to add that Konstantina was telling me also that the first letter to a newspaper in Britain criticizing the colonel's regime was a letter to The Guardian written by a former colleague in the LSE Law Department. That's a little plug for our moral superiority. We talked about the colonels. Let's move to Cyprus. Neophytos.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you very much, everyone, for attending the talk tonight. This is the second lecture that I had the honor to give at the LSE. The first one was by invitation by Zinos Stavrinidis that we lost a week ago. I would like to mention his work and also to mention how grateful he was to you, Kevin, for offering the support to Cypriot studies all these years. He talked about you several times and how generous the support was from LSE, both in his initiative, but also research on Cyprus in general. As Kevin mentioned, an international relations and conflict resolution scholar. So I work on identifying patterns where countries differ, both historically and also comparatively. That's my work. So whenever I look at a case like Cyprus, how is Cyprus different from anything that has happened to Greece in the last 200 years? How is Cyprus different from other post-colonial decolonizing society? What happens in Cyprus in 1974 that is different from other cases? I'm a comparativist and always ask the question of how does a case that I'm looking at compares to the universe of other cases around the world. So the first thing that I would like to put on the table today is that Cyprus does not fit the British-Greek history of bilateral relations. We have this very beautiful relationship, sometimes problematic, sometimes not, between the UK and Greece historically. The Greek War of Independence, World War I, World War II. My favorite is the referendum of 1862, where the Greeks are looking for a king. And this is the favorite of all referendums, not just in Greek-Turkish, not in Greek-British relations. Often as is forced out of the country, and the Greeks are looking for a king. And what do? They run a referendum with several royal families around the world. They choose a grandson of Napoleon, someone from the Russian royal family, royal families around Europe. And guess what? There is a landslide of the British royal family. So very close to the British throughout their history. This is not unprecedented. When you have a small country, normally that lacks big territory, doesn't have a hinterland. Think of Portugal or the Low Countries. They're looking for allies around the world. So they find the hegemon, the biggest country, and they work with them in order to establish a relationship, right? This is what we call bad bargaining in international relations. A small country working with a big country that is not threatening to ease and building a relation. But in addition to what Konstantina mentioned, there is a very strong cultural relationship. There is a commercial relationship. There is a relationship between the royal families. It doesn't happen in 1862. Victoria refuses to send her son to serve in Greeks. They bring the Glücksburgs instead. But she gives to the Glücksburgs the Eftanissa as a dowry. So that speaks to the very, very good relationship at the time. So Greece, for the most part, is a classic case of what we call in international relations, a case of bad bargaining, a case where it works with a bigger country in order to keep its security. Cyprus is not. And if I have to summarize the history of Greece and Cyprus in one sentence, in the last 200 years, Greece works with the United Kingdom. It multiplies its territory over 100 years. Cyprus does not. It fights with the big country in the region. It leaves the British hegemony as part of its independence, and then it's only a matter of time that it's invaded by Turkey. So that's in a nutshell what happens in the last 200. Simplistic view of seeing history. So one can think of a counterfactual here. What if? Kevin asked the question of what if. You could have an agreement before the Oka struggle between the United Kingdom and Greece, solving the Cyprus problem, who have maintained the pattern of close Anglo relationships, as well prevented conflict with Turkish and the Turkish Cypriots. A very useful academic exercise that I often do with my students, a thing of finding a solution to the Cyprus problem before 1955. And what kind of options did we eliminate? There have been so many different ways of solving the Cyprus problem before the conflict erupted. When the problem erupted, what is a puzzle there is that you have this very close relationship, but this does not prevent these high levels of violence against British soldiers in Cyprus. So you can see EOKA to be blamed there, but also violations of human rights by the British forces against Cypriots. You mentioned Barbara Castle. I interviewed my dad just before he died a few months ago as part of the invitation to this event. And he's from Kathikas, where there was a massive British retaliation after an incident that happened, after an ambush that happened in their region. And Barbara Castle came to the village and to interview them, the civilians, interview the villagers of trying to find out of the various violations and various human rights abuses that happened by the British forces. So who is the fault? And I understand here there is a strong bond representing the Anglo-Hellenic relationship. The Cyprus problem is an exception of that. That could have been avoided. In international negotiations, we often study conflict between sides that have long enmities, right? Here we have a situation that is even more puzzling. We have a strong relationship, and that the pattern of cooperation breaks with the Cyprus question. This is the British-Greek Cypriot angle. And of course, later on becomes a much bigger issue with Turkey and the Turkish Cypriots. Cyprus also doesn't fit the decolonization pattern. That's another puzzle. The Cypriot independence was not preceded by some form of local governance and institutions. Often the British were institution builders, right? In different colonies, establishing local governments, and that the local government negotiates with the British, their independence. So you have a moment of transition. You didn't have that in Cyprus. That was interrupted because of Septembriana. Independence was also not negotiated by Cypriot elites, by the two motherlands, who also had very weak governments that are being undermined by others as part of the process. The British were not involved in the negotiations until much later. First, Averov and Zorlou reach an agreement. They write the key aspects of the Cyprus problem in Zurich, and then we go to London, and there Makarios negotiated with the British the basis. The British were interested on the basis. That's why we get the sovereign British basis. They get some last-minute constitutional details later on. They have an influence on this, but just to give you an example, when they negotiate the constitution, there are 4 additional communities that have to be written in the constitution. There is a lengthy negotiation among Cypriots, what is going to happen to the Maronites, the Armenians, the Ladis, and the English. But then the English are being dropped out of the negotiation because United Kingdom doesn't have the influence that the United Kingdom will have in those situations. So another exceptionalist there with decolonization pattern. How does that factor? What do they imply for the future of the new republic? So we break the pattern of positive British Hellenic relations. We break the pattern of decolonization and the transition. The young republic lacked the security provider. It was only a time for that to become a victim of insecurity. In constitutional terms, it was also an exception. It had very, very un-British features. Take, for instance, every British colony. It has a first past the post electoral system. It's a parliamentary democracy. We ended up with the only presidential system in Europe at the time. Highly divisive constitution with no deadlock mechanism. One positive thing is that we had a neutral judge. That is very common to have a foreign judge. And unfortunately, even for that, it didn't work very well because all the sides agreed to get a German jurist who had a very, very notorious past. He was also a Nazi in addition to everything else. I can talk about that later on It's another project that I'm working on right now, how we ended up having that individual serving in the Supreme Court. So all these, taking all this into consideration, it was only a question of time for things to fall apart in the Republic. Sometimes you can talk about agency, and I really appreciate there's a lot of work in Cyprus right now, recognizing the faults of Grivas, the faults of Makarios, the faults of the Turkish Cyprus, and this is fantastic to have that type of research. Agency matters in international relations, but when you look at it from a structural perspective, when the structures are not there, when you take security away from a region that is so sensitive, things are about to fall apart. Agency doesn't matter as much. And you always have leaders who are going to do the wrong thing. You're always going to have a dictatorship somewhere. I think I read in a study a few years back that Greece had more coups in the 20th century than Turkey. So you're always going to have a junta. You're always going to have someone who did something wrong. But if you don't have the structures there, if you don't have the security providers, the security guarantees, then it's likely that you're going to fall apart. So in addition to having their own constitutional formulas. So the third exceptional list is what happened after 1974. You have the invasion, the failure to prevent the invasion. But what is remarkable after the invasion is a response of the Cypriots to their division. So you have the Cypriots fighting up until 1974. You had some signs that a peace movement was emerging before 1974. If you look at the past, you can find people talking in conferences, establishing the peace movement, the labor movements, the leftist parties were quite engaged. But after 1974, we have something that is particularly exceptional, in the Greek Cypriot community, more specifically. In most cases that I have seen, after experiences such as shock, where a third of the population is being expelled, you get division, you get depression, you get civil war. On the Greek Cypriot side, you have few months after, and contrary to what the interview said, the Greek Cypriots coming up and say, we want to establish a federation. Glafkos Cleridis goes to Gallery Argo and says, we have a vision, we went through a shock, we're going to establish a federation, and this will be the solution. And that was much, with the Communist Party supporting that, with Makarios and Kyprianou signing 2 high-level agreements, with intellectuals like Stavrinidis and others writing books and say, this is the vision of the Cypriots, with the British government supporting that, with the Americans supporting that, establishing the first peace plans and very specific ideas for the settlement of the Cyprus question, with the Security Council, with the support of the Soviet Union back then, giving the guidelines, specific guidelines of how to establish a federation. This is a third exceptionalism that we see in 1974. And in Cyprus, even though we didn't manage to resolve the Cyprus question, we have reached very close consensus in coming about to solve the Cyprus, the key dimensions of what we call a complicated question. And this is something that we have seen following up 1974. The EU accession and Brexit provided a very strong test of the Cypriot-UK relationships. UK was a leading force behind the Cypriot accession to the European Union. And likewise, some of us were expecting that Brexit would be problematic, especially with the questions of the British bases, which are quite problematic for some of us. If you look at the text, it's still a colonial text where a part, not only the part of the British bases, but essentially the entire of the Republic of Cyprus is being used by the British. When I was a little kid, I used to go fishing, for instance, in Akamas, which is our national park, and I could see everywhere empty shells because of the bombing. Imagine in Britain walking around in your parks and finding empty shells from military exercises in that. Post-Ukraine and post-Gaza, the relationship remains unequal. We might see a return back to a more conflictual pattern in the future. So they're both warnings for the relationship, the Cypriot-British relationship after Gaza becoming worse, but also opportunities. We can see public opinion data that say a lot about the possibilities of resolving the Cyprus problem. If I can have 1 more minute, can I have 1 more minute to show some of the more promising sides of what Cyprus can benefit from? Cyprus has been described by many as the diplomats' graveyard, right? British diplomats, UN diplomats trying to solve the Cyprus problem. That's a very, very catchy term, but we don't necessarily see many successful negotiations elsewhere in the world. So some of the work also funded by the LSE with the support of the Observatory, with increasingly majorities on both sides becoming pro-federal, with his support increasingly from the youth for a federal settlement in Cyprus, and also by refugees, people who have lost their properties. Also, some of the experimental data show that even with minor changes in resolving the Cyprus, changing the Cyprus problem on compensations, for instance, we can get majorities on both sides of the divide. This is part of what we call a conjoint experiment, where we give different packages and different combinations of settlements on both sides, and even minor amendments in the way that we can devise a settlement can take us from a 39% support that we had in the Annan plan. We estimate the Annan plan today to something like 59%. The most important issues here is that here we have, for instance, guarantees from Greece, Turkey, and the United Kingdom. I think of Cyprus as a small island. You can have guarantees by third countries, which are close to the United Kingdom, but not necessarily motherlands. We had Australia, Japan, and Canada here, and this can give us 59% in an experimental package. So to sum up, there are prospects for positive relations, and there's no reason to dismiss the possibility of coming together, both the Greek and Turkish Cypriots, but also with the support of the United Kingdom to address a problem that has been a wound in Greek-British relations and Greek-Turkish relations for the past 50 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Neophytos. You covered so much there. Can I just ask a critical question, but if you could keep the answer very short so we can go to the Q&A. Sometimes I'm struck that the basic parameters of British policy towards Cyprus before the kernels, during the kernels, and post the kernels has remained consistent with certain basic principles. And I wonder, would you say that British policy towards Cyprus after 1974 showed major differences in its basic principles from that of the 50s and 60s?
What do you mean by that?
In the sense that the conception of what the problem is, we need to be concerned with the security issues. We shouldn't allow enosis. We shouldn't disturb the balance on the island, etc. The British policy before 1967 was remarkably similar to policy post 1974.
Yeah, precisely, because from the British side, there was the metaphor of the unsinkable aircraft carrier, right? This is the metaphor that they use. So for the British, the priority was the security of the Eastern Mediterranean, the relationship with NATO, the Baghdad Pact, which was also extremely important at the time. So these were fundamental issues for British security. So they are for any sort of negotiation, especially if you're the weakest side in the equation, the Greek Cypriots in that particular equation, is to align your interest with the interest of the British. If you go against those interests, you're most likely going to lose the negotiation.
Okay, thank you very much. We have lots of people here, and we have a number of people watching online. Let me now open it to questions from the audience. I think we will have a phone. Yes, we have a microphone for you to speak from. Could you simply say who you are and make sure it's a question and brief, please, so we can get as many as possible in. Who'd like to begin? Not for the first time, I invite Bernard Casey to be the first person to ask the question.
Thank you. Yeah, Bernard Casey, also this place and others. We haven't said very much about the position of Turkey in this. Konstantina said there is more to be done and there is more that she is doing. But to what extent was Turkey concerned about enosis, and to what extent was Turkey concerned about the vulnerability of its population, and how justified was that for its reactions in 74? Because we often tend to look at this from a perspective of Greece, of the views of America, and we don't, and the UK, and we don't very often seem to talk about what Turkey was thinking about, what the Turkish minority was thinking about. Now, I've been to Cyprus. I have seen the abandoned Turkish villages in the south of the island, which date from very, very much earlier. So there was a history there.
Okay.
There was a reason for concern.
Thanks very much. Other questions? Could we take the colleague over here, please?
Thank you very
It's on.
Thank you very much. Ilia Expolia from University of Aberdeen. One question for each. For Neophytos, it's very interesting, fascinating research, both of you guys. In one of your scenarios, none of them, they had the option of no guarantees. So it's out of the table for this. And for Konstantina,
Sorry, just on that, I didn't quite hear. None of the scenarios
scenarios had the option of actually have no guarantees, no external
Okay,
guarantors.
Yeah.
And for Konstantina, of course, you are focusing on the 7 years, but if you can draw some parallels with the 1950s, the British foreign policy from the 1950s with the 1960s, do you see that you see more continuities or changes? Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you. And can we take the gentleman here, please? It's coming to you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Unless I'm mistaken, I heard you say that the invasion of Cyprus by Turkey was historically on the cards long before that. And I would have to agree with you, but would you agree with me that perhaps the seeds of that invasion and British policy were planted not long after Harold Macmillan became Prime Minister in January 1957? That's good old British Empire divide and rule. He mentioned about partition, and the following day, apparently lots of demonstrations by Turkish Cypriots shouting Taksim. So I wonder if you'd agree with that. And also, it was mentioned about the Six-Day War in 1967, which everything that happens is all related, and that was a pivotal event. But I wonder if you'd also agree with me that perhaps the Yom Kippur War in 1973 was also very pivotal in what happened in that part of the world. And it's the first time that the Israeli state his existence was threatened. So an American and British interest are never the same, despite the so-called special relationship. So
Okay. Thank you very much. There's a question online from Terry Bloxham. He refers to popular publications such as Lawrence Carrell's Bitter Lemons, which recounts a personal and professional experience of the troubles in Cyprus during the British occupation in the 1950s. We also have Elif Shafka's The Island of Missing Trees, which tells a fictional story about the 1974 invasion of Nicosia. Are these popular publications of any value in understanding the personal experience of the peoples in what became a divided Cyprus? What other personal accounts do we have of this period in Cyprus? Quite a variety of questions. Do you want to, if you would, respond to this question about personal experiences and fiction of the lived experience in Cyprus?
Yeah, there are wonderful pieces of literature, both by Cypriots and non-Cypriots, on that reflect the events of 1974 and what happened later. My favorite is a poem by a Maronite. So sometimes we talk about Greek and Turkish Cypriots. It's a Maronite poet who wrote about his home in Kormakidis, and I'm translating that in English right now. I love both books. I wouldn't call a Cypriot hero Kazantzakis, though, as Elif Shafak did. I would prefer a more Cypriot name for it. But these are fantastic pieces of literature that shows the deep drama of the division. That's what we also find in a number of surveys. So to answer more specifically, if I can go to some of the questions, the question of guarantees. Normally in peacekeeping, in post-conflict societies, when one signs a peace agreement, you don't leave the sides by themselves. You need some kind of a mission, UN mission often, or a mission by another international organization to come to the country and provide the guarantees. So you have people who are returning in homes that are occupied by others, and this is their own homes. You need to be able to monitor that. That's a meaning of implementation mechanism. We don't call it guarantees anymore in the negotiations. It's our implementation mechanism. Countries that help to support you when you need that. We lack those after the independence of the Republic of Cyprus, and that led to the very quick collapse of institutions. So one lesson learned from the 1960s is that we need to have a neutral, credible mechanism after the settlement of the Cyprus issue. Nobody would trust each other. You can't leave it on the goodwill of the other side. You need to have those guarantees and implementation mechanisms that would translate what is in the agreement into actual outcomes. That's the essence of any peacekeeping. And the question is that you have a very small island that provides so much in terms of its strategic location to the rest of the world and through the British bases. Can we not find 3 neutral countries around the world in order to guarantee both the Greek and Turkish Cypriot interests? That's a question. If you answer that question, you get into the settlement of the Cyprus issue very, very quickly. So that's number one. And that's what we miss in 1960s. We had the option there to join NATO. And ironically, the only agreement ever made by the Greek Cypriots and Turkey was not to join NATO. Cyprus joined the non-aligned movement with the support, with the Turkish Cypriots not exercising veto because they got the instructions from Turkey. And the reason that Turkey didn't want Cyprus to join NATO and be part of the club is that it would have allowed Turkey more easily to invade Cyprus in the future. And yes, I agree with you. That was already on the cards. It was already on the cards. And you can see the path leading to that, even from the 1960s.
Thanks. Very quickly, as an international relations scholar, you like structural conditions, etc., and you referred to agency. Surely the events of 1974 would have been very, very different if Makarios had not been president in Cyprus.
Surely, but you could have anyone else who could do exactly the same thing. I mean, Makarios was a not very unusual individual given their legacy. We often criticize Makarios, but Makarios, the equivalent of Makarios around the world, ended up becoming extremely authoritarian and even more repressive than Makarios was. So you could have someone who was even worse than Makarios. And
I meant in terms of triggering particular events, the Greek colonel's response to him.
Absolutely.
Konstantina, you had a question about, yes, we haven't mentioned Turkey. Could you answer that very quickly? Then I've got another question online for you.
Yes, I've got 3 questions, so I'll try and
Please
be
do.
as epigrammatic as possible. So the Turkish prism does not dominate British evaluation of Greek affairs up until 1974. They keep saying that our policy towards Turkey after constitutional, after coups took place and the democratic governments were forcibly replaced by generals did not change. So there's absolutely no need why we need to challenge our relationship with the kernels on account of that. Interestingly enough, on behalf of the British public, there it doesn't seem to be as much interest in all these unconstitutional developments in Turkey either. So when we have those changes in government, the newspapers are not following the events to the same extent, and the British officials at the time do not find themselves under similarly pressurizing conditions to account for their actions of relatively close relations with both allies. Certainly, Turkey is very important in terms of its significance for NATO. And when they analyze the strategic significance of Greece, they always say that it needs to be balanced and kept in control and relations in a way that do not upset Turkey, but does not seem to be up until later into 1974 a different or a differentiating prism in terms of official policies towards the kernels. Now, 1950s and 1960s, that's a fascinating period. And because of the difficulties of the Anglo-Greek relations on account of what was happening mainly in Cyprus at the time, were under extreme duress, the British in the 1960s seem extremely relieved that they can actually finally restore their broken relations with Greece and the damaged relations on account of the human rights abuses that were taking place in the 1950s and the 1960s. And they were particularly optimistic up until 1967 about the possibility of having restoration of normal and of the special relationship that was so much challenged in earlier times. So they certainly are very keen to leave that chapter behind. The kernels are not very keen, though. So every time the British, during the 7 year that the kernels stayed in power, decided to air some frustration privately, most of the times, they didn't want to be seen to be doing that publicly, and pushing the kernels against all these kind of allegations about human rights abuses, the kernels were very quick to turn that and attack the British of hypocrisy on accounts of their dealings in Cyprus in the 1950s and the 1960s. So yes, these are very fascinating times, and I'd be more than happy to discuss in more detail later on. And regarding the Yom Kippur War, Greece's relations significance to NATO becomes particularly accentuated in 67 and 73. As I just mentioned, the kernels used the 6-day war as a platform to confirm their allegiance and the open access they would afford to NATO in all military bases that they needed in order to evacuate, for instance, facilitate evacuations, but also for refueling and whatever were the NATO needs during the 6-day war. And when relations with this country become a little bit cooler before the conservatives decide to try to restore them a little bit in 1973, and we have the Yom Kippur War, the kernels are actually threatening the NATO alliance that they will actually not give them access to their bases. And this is a clear point. This sends red flags to the Americans, who are buttressing their colleagues in this country to really avoid taking any sort of action that would perhaps alienate the kernels and cause this kind of long-term disunity or fraction within the alliance. So they seem to be, from a NATO point of view, the main anchors, the main points where the Americans are pushing these governments for absolutely as normal relations with the kernels as possible in order to ensure that military cooperation with NATO will continue unabated. Okay. Absolutely essential issues.
Thanks. I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 last questions, but we're going to have to be very quick, and I'm reading these for the first time. A question from John Kittmer, who is the chairman of the Anglo-Hellenic League and watching us online. Thank you for 3 excellent presentations. Could Konstantina Maragkou say a few words about, 1, the importance of British public opinion of the presence of members of the Greek resistance in London between 1967 and 1974, and two, the importance to the Greek resistance at large of British public opinion. To what extent did they influence each other? Did this relationship influence the restoration of democracy? Big question.
Absolutely.
Give us a succinct answer if you
I
can.
think it suffices to say that after I finished my first book on Greek-English relations to between 67 and 74, I had, on the basis of British public opinion, British public resistance within this country, enough material to embark on my second project, which I hope to turn into a book soon, about the absolute significance of the mobilization of public opinion in this country, the absolute significance of the channels of communication that were open even among embassies for information about human rights abuses to be channeled out of Greece safely into this country so that they reach the Guardian and the BBC in particular, the Deutsche Welle in Germany. These were the key outposts that Greek resistors back home, back in Greece, were very keen to supply material and information with. We had, for the first time, the article that appeared in the Guardian in November of 1967, which was making named allegations on human rights abuses against a ruling regime. And that on its own, because for the first time we had victims of torture passing information to the British public, and the British public publicizing that information in popular outposts. For the very first time, we have Amnesty International steering its interest away from political prisoners towards the issue of torture. And we do know the very direct link that this shift in the Amnesty International's approach had, for instance, towards the eventual signing of the Convention Against Torture. So what I have established, because of the absolute significance of the protest and mobilization, but not just in terms of showing discomfort or revulsion, as Sir Roger said, but collecting for the very first time information that is 100% accurate. And on the basis of that, persecute and sort of accuse a government, even in international fora like the Council of Europe. My latest research really shows that Greece and the human rights abuse of the kernels and mobilization against them is really truly exceptional indeed, for a number of reasons, not least this evolution of Amnesty International's shift towards torture. Obviously, they are based here, they have branches around the world, but it is the London branch that jumps and uses the Greek case because of this credible information as a platform to overcome all the credibility issues that this think tank had in its infancy, in its earlier days. And, they use all these very good channels that the Greek emigres had created already in this country. And they certainly have a very, very strong leverage on the British government. Yes, the British government never broke its relations with the kernels. I'm not even sure how influential it was in the restoration of the Greek democracy. The British find themselves in the whole process rather powerless. And I think that is a position that they kept reinstating in their communications. We have a special responsibility, but not enough power. Every time that something the British public was pushing for a change, they kept saying the real power lays with the Americans. It is up to them to force the kernels to change course. And when the Americans are sending their vice president on an official visit to Greece, we really don't have much influence to change anything. But the British public remained loud, remained really phenomenal. Very few countries I've seen where mobilization has been as extensive. Scandinavians here are a very good example, but they had a much more permissive sort of environment. Like Britain was still trying to redefine its role in the post-war affairs and post-Suez and everything, and post-1962. The Scandinavians had already redefined their profile following decolonization and the Second World War as champions of human rights and champions of democracy. The British, on the other hand, wanted to be seen like this, but were lacking in conviction. This did not stop the British public, both the Greek emigres, but also British citizens. I've interviewed actually British citizens who were traveling to Greece, packing their cars full of explosives to take back to Athens, to just, cause mayhem and detonate bombs and cause mayhem and bring about the kernel's collapse. I've interviewed British citizens who were forging passports in this country and taking them and sending them back to Greece in order to make sure that tortured victims of the regime would be able, on those with these passports, to travel abroad and testify in international fora like the Council of Europe about the abuses that they had suffered and the systematic use of torture on behalf of the kernels. Okay. So there is absolutely no doubt about I really keep referring to the same word, but it is remarkable, it is phenomenal, it is really outstanding, the amount of energy, resources, effort, and commitment shown by the British public to bring about restoration of democracy in Greece.
There are other stories, of course. There's a Richard Parker, an academic at Harvard University, who was collaborating with Andreas Papandreou, traveling to Greece during the kernels, forging passports and bringing Greeks out of the junta period. You mentioned about public opinion in Britain and a difference perhaps with the timidity of successive British governments. You mentioned about Scandinavia. There's also the Dutch government that was very active in terms of the Council of Europe. Max van der Stoel was the Dutch foreign minister at the time. He returned to Athens in August 74 and was cheered at the airport quite vociferously. There was a platea in Athens named after Max van der Stoel because of his support for the anti-junta protest. I'm going to give the last sentence to Neophytos.
Yeah, the very interesting, you mentioned permissive conditions for diaspora mobilization. When it comes to the Cyprus question, we have a very large Cypriot diaspora in London. But unfortunately, the conditions were not permissive because the Cypriot diaspora tended to come from a leftist background and they were seen as suspicious and communist. Therefore, they couldn't have an impact. And in fact, if you look at it historically, the British position and the communist position, leftist position in Cyprus are very close in terms of avoiding violence. At some point in London, both the British and the communists were very hesitant. They were even thinking of postponing the agreement in order to calm things down, go through some sort of self-government that I mentioned before, and then go for independence rather than go for Zurich, London. But those complementarity of interests did never evolve in a relationship. Because on the one hand, you have the British government, on the other hand, you have Cypriots who are very pro-reconciliation, but nonetheless were from the left. Therefore, they couldn't be permitted to enter the political system and the equation of the negotiations as foreseen by British policymakers.
Thank you. We've covered a lot of issues here, and I'm going to encourage you to move rather quickly downstairs to the 5th floor of this building for the wine reception provided by the Hellenic Observatory and the Anglo-Hellenic League. It's a huge topic, and we've touched on some very interesting points. We can pursue these over the wine in the wine reception. Let me repeat that the wine being provided to you, do please appreciate that it's being provided to you free of charge. But we can have a good conversation. But please join me in thanking our speakers this evening.
Yeah.